Everyone, good morning. I'll be doing a presentation on my grandfather, David George Bond. I have a question for you first. Who drove here this morning? Who used their signal light this morning? Now, be honest, if you didn't, just tell the truth. Because not everybody does. But my grandfather had the first patent for the signal light. And he's one of the unsung inventors in Bertie County history. And what makes it amazing is I know there's several people here who knew him. And he's my grandpa. He died actually Valentine's Day 1999. So I was 24 at the time in grad school. So I had a chance to get to know him. So I'm going to talk about him today, his legacy, and how he is one of the great unsung inventors, not just in Bertie County history, but also in American history as well. Here's the cover of the book, and it's called Unsung But Forever Remembered. The man who invented the automobile turn signal, David George Bond. And one thing knew my grandpa, he did not like taking pictures. Many times we would come down, because my dad raised in New York, he would have to sneak in a picture of him. He would cover his face so you could not see him. The only two times I can remember actually seeing an actual picture of my grandpa was for two weddings, when his goddaughter, Miss Cindy, got married, and my auntie Ethel Goddard Reed was married. So those are the two times I can remember a picture. What I did do, I found an old picture of him from about 50 years ago at the wedding. And so I had a videographer who just kind of photoshopped a little bit, and it looked just like him with his tux on. So thankfully, he did a great job on it. So now, who was David George Bond? David George Bond was a devoted father, husband, grandfather, and an accomplished inventor. He was born in 1907 on the sharecropping farm in Bertie County. Matter of fact, he even worked on the Gillum farm. He would tell a story about how he hated working on the Gillum farm, because many times as a sharecropper, you work 12 to 16 hours a day. And also the children did. And we'll talk about that later, because my dad, Turner Charles Bond Sr., also worked on a sharecropping farm. And many times, even as young people, they spent 8 months out the year on the sharecropping farm. Many times they not go to school, but maybe 3 or 4 months out the year. His parents was Edmund and Amanda Berry Bond. So we talked about the Bonds, the Rascals, the Smallwood, the Gillums, and the Spellers. So if you also have Berry in your family, we're probably all related as well. Go figure in Bertie County. A genius at heart. At the age of 16, my grandpa was sent to a school, Martin Vocational School, which is now known as the W.C. Chen's building. At the time, it was in Palmer. Now it's in Robsonville, because back then we know the schools were segregated. So his sister, Aunt Sarah, my great Aunt Sarah, found a school that he could go to, he could board, and actually get a good education. Because at the time, the schools in Bertie County was not really much able to give him a sufficient education as he needed. Because those were my grandpa. He was a very, very intelligent guy, very hands-on. He would draw diagrams of just things. He would just come up with inventions off the top of his head. Many things he invented, he never even got patent. Like in his house, which is still today on 445 Grabtown Road, he built the majority of that house with his own hands. And my grandfather had different things in the house. You walk in the room, you leave the room a couple minutes later, the lights will go off. You know, even some things he didn't patent, he had in his house. So he was a genius at heart. So when he was at this vocational school in Martin County, which is now, like I said, part of W.C. Chen's building, this is when he came up with the idea for the invention. And so the story goes, he mentioned one time in the newspaper report, he said he was looking out the window, and he said God showed him that cars needed a signal light, because the blinking would save and be safe for the people. Because in other words, you're driving, it's dark. Back then, you stuck your hand out left, right, if you're switching lanes. So it's hard. And my grandfather had a sense of humor. He said, you know, when you're dark skinned like me, you can stick your hand out in the dark. No one's going to see your hand, and it could cause an accident. Because he just had a sense of humor like that. And he was right. But he said he was standing at the window, and God showed him cars need signal light. And he was a devoted man of God, and he would get visions like that. And that's when he started. And so the people at the school gave him the equipment. And so he started working on it and said, okay, we could make the signal blink. And matter of fact, the idea of backing up and the light coming on when you back up, the brake light also was part of this invention. So when I say he was a genius at heart, he was truly a genius at heart. Remember, he started building this at the age of 16. That's what a lot of people did not know. You know, we think of kids in high school at 16, they barely want to study. They barely want to do homework. This guy's inventing things. He was just a genius. Like I would tell people, And me being a school teacher for 26 years, I say Albert Einstein, Oppenheimer, those guys had nothing on my grandpa. Not at all. Now, what I wanted to show you is he actually got the patent for this. He applied for the patent in January of 1926. He was approved by the U.S. government March 1st, 1927. And here's why it's important. A year and a half ago, I was on WNCT News, and they did a story on my grandfather, and I was on the news. And I mentioned how the patent was official March 1st, 1927. And if you look closely, it's hard to see, but I have the book with it. It has his name, his signature, the patent number, and also March 1st, 1927. The guy who got the credit and full credit for Signal Light, his patent came out 2 years after my grandfather. So that's something to think about. So this was the drawings he actually made. This was a Ford Model T. And this was drawings he made with different compartments and different parts of his signal light, even with the brake light. And mind you, he started this at the age of 16. So when it was fully patented and official by the U.S. government, it was 1927. So at the time, he had just turned 20 years old. That tells you something about the man and the genius that he is and was. Now, here's also an explanation of how this invention was going to work. And it says the U.S. Patent Office. It was officially patent. It wasn't a partial patent. It was a full patent. And by the way, at the time, he lived in, those who know Kwitzner, North Carolina, he lived in the Kwitzner section of Bertie County. I did some research on that as well. Now, in a 2-page explanation, he talks about how this signal light will work. Now, I have a doctorate degree. I don't understand what he wrote. That's what type of genius he is. I read it a few times, and some of our family members read it when we found it. And I said, do you know what Grandpa was talking about? No, sir. So if you read it, you understand that for him to do this was amazing. And he had his sisters help him get the paperwork and the lawyer to make sure it was patented correctly. He got a lawyer to sign. He got notarized and everything, because back then, during the Jim Crow era, they tried to do what they could to make sure African Americans did not get compensated for inventions. We were talking about Garrett Morgan, where Garrett Morgan, he did get $40,000 for the traffic light, but $40,000 for a billion-dollar invention is really peanuts. So he went through the proper procedure and the protocol to make sure it was patented properly. Now, the one issue with patents, unfortunately, is it's like a driver's license. They expire. Now, back then, to renew his license for the patent, it would cost about $85. Now, this I got from a well-recognized source, his daughter, my auntie, that he went to 3 separate banks in Bertie County. All 3 banks rejected him and did not give him a loan. And then he had one guy who said, well, David George, if you sign this, I'll give you the money for it. But then he read the fine print and he had his sister read it. And the fine print basically said if he gave him the rights to it, my grandfather would give about 5% profit. So Grandpa no dummy, so he said no. So the patent expired, unfortunately. So he never got compensated for it. But the great thing about patents is the patent number never expires. Now, the hard thing for me to do was to find this on the internet. We found an old copy of the patent, but if you look on a Google search, you have to do a very hard, thorough Google search to find it. You have to put the patent number in. You have to go on Google Patent, put the number in, put his name in, and hopefully you'll be able to find it if it's still on. Because a few years ago, it was on, and then mysteriously, you couldn't find it on the internet anymore. And they also knew that the Bond family was doing the research on it, because there were some websites that were blocked from this information. Go figure. So now, basically, in little history of Bertie County, which you all know, there's a lot of segregation in Bertie. Matter of fact, there was a lynching about an hour away from Bertie County where my grandfather lived. And he also got death threats. You know, he did not want my grandmother to know, but he did. And my grandmother was Priscilla Earl Rasco. So we talked about the Bonds and the Rascos. You see how we all together and related. Now, I don't know if they're related, second, third cousins, but, you know, she was a Rasco. And so that being said, he was concerned about the death threats because there were some people from all over the country, even Canada, writing letters saying, how did this sharecropper from Bertie invent this thing? And won't interview him. But he also got some letters which were threatening. And the letter he said which concerned him most, and I remember him telling me when I was in college, one letter said, not only will we kill you, but we'll kill all 11 of your children. That concerned him because he figured, how did they know he had 11 children? Obviously, he did their research. So when the patent expired, there was not much you could do. They give it to the highest bidder. And the one thing I'm trying to find out is, out of curiosity, who did get compensated for the invention, because that I've not been able to find out. But out of curiosity, I'd just like to know. It's not a vengeful thing, not even spiteful, just a curiosity, because it makes you wonder. Because my grandfather lived a pretty successful life. He was a business guy. He cut grass. He has his own soil business. And the house on Grabtown Road, he built pretty much from the ground up. And it's still there, and it's still owned by the Bond family. So he was far from broke. But you also have to think, what if? What if he would have got compensated for it? And being a humble man, it didn't bother him as much. But every now and then he make a comment, and sometimes my grandmother make a comment like, wow, we could have way more than what we had, especially raising 11 children. That's not an easy task at all. And so, as I mentioned before, my grandfather lived a very good life. One of the things I used to love, because I was raised in New York. My dad, Turner Charles Bond, raised in New York. Those are my dad. He was an engineer at Con Edison in New York. He also, those who know, was a saved, sanctified, Holy Ghost filled pastor and bishop. And he passed about 4 years ago. And Mr. Cherry here, who buried a lot of my family members, and he's definitely a family member and a friend of our family. And he knew my dad and knew the man of God he was and what he stood for. And he got that from our grandfather. So that house right there, 445 Grabtown Road, is still owned by the Bond family. He had it built in the year 1956. And it's 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and it's still in pretty good shape. There's been renovations done. My father actually was one of the people that did renovations to the house a few years ago when he was alive. Back in 2011 and 2012, he had put new plumbing in the house. And matter of fact, for a couple of years, he actually had church services in the house. So he made good use of it, because my grandfather being a man of God, I know he was happy that church service was going on in the house that he built. Now, here's a list of my grandfather's children, and I'm going to go over some of them briefly, because what's amazing is that even all that he went through, he could have been bitter, angry, upset, but my grandpa and my grandmother, they lived a pretty satisfying life. They loved God. They loved to work hard, and they were awesome parents and grandparents, and I'm glad I got a chance to know them. Now, the first one I'm going to point to is David Lawrence Bond. The name sounds familiar. David Lawrence Bond was the oldest. He also was a pastor in Harlem and was in the military. He served in Korea. And so you see in the Bond family, military, education, and ministry were big. And some of us covered all of it. Not surprising. In my family, it's there. Ministers, educators, and military. And for me, I did the education and ministry part. I did not go to military. I almost went to the Navy. And then I remember one time my mom was crying. It's like, don't take my baby when the recruiter came to the house. And Desert Storm just came because she was like, you already took 2 of my babies, don't take another one. So I said, okay, Mom, I'll just go to college. I get it. And what is interesting about David Lawrence Bond is my auntie Ethel, when I was born, told my parents that you have to name him Lawrence. You have to name one of the kids that my mom had Lawrence. So my name is Stephen Lawrence Bond. I get that from my oldest uncle, David Lawrence. Ethel Goddard Reed Bond was a math coach, mathematician, administrating Bertie County. And to do that in Bertie back then as a female, that's an amazing task. And she also used to sing at Indianwood Baptist Church as well. Johnny Norman, we call him Uncle P. Huh?
Yep.
Ethel. Yes, Ethel Bond.
Didn't she work in California?
Yes. Yeah, she went to San Diego State. She got a master's at San Diego State. Yes, she did. Yes.
You need to put that in there.
I'm glad you put that, because I'm trying to do something for her book-wise. That part where I'm thinking about, I had a vision about that too, because I want her story to be told too. Because you know her, she's an amazing woman. And so she's done a lot of amazing things too. She's quiet and humble by it. But you told her for 10 minutes, she'll tell you now. Johnny Norman, we call Uncle Pete. He actually had a patent too. He had a patent for a candy wrapper. And so he got a little money for it. So the invention part of our family is just always been prevalent. He also owned a furniture store in the Bronx called B&D Furniture with my other uncle, which was Roger Bond. We call him Uncle Cupid. So they co-owned a furniture store together. Now, Turner Charles Bond, that was my father. He served in the military. He was an electrician, engineer for 31 years, and he also was a pastor and bishop, and an amazing dad as well. Now, Reuben Allen Bond. Reuben Allen Bond was also man of God, played music, instruments, also was a faithful man of God, also in Vietnam. And that's the other thing. Many of my uncles fought bravely in Vietnam and served his country. Amazing. Got injured and served his country. And it goes to show the loyalty that African Americans had. Even during the Jim Crow time, even during the segregation time, we still fought and defended this country. And that also needs to be mentioned because sometimes when civil rights movement come along, and I'm a history teacher, sometimes there's a stereotype that black or African Americans are not loyal and devoted to the country. No, we fought and we defended the country in every war. And some of my uncles fought valiantly in Vietnam and North Korea. My uncle Dave was in Korea. Reuben Allen was in Vietnam. My uncle Curtis Cromwell was an educator as well, and he also fought in Vietnam, got hurt, and got disability and won many awards because he saved part of his platoon from a sneak attack from the Viet Cong. So you see there's a very amazing history with his children, what they did. Luke Bunch Bond also was a musician and singer. Another cool guy. Uncle Luke was a funny dude. He was amazing. And he actually had a house behind my grandpa's house as well. William Bond, Uncle Billy, is now in Mannheim, Germany. Him and his wife Lilo still live there. Now, they've been living there for about the last 50-some years. Being in Jim Crow South, him being married to a German woman was not the most ideal situation in North Carolina, not in the 1960s. So they've been living in Mannheim for the last 56 years. Uncle George Emmanuel Bond was also a musician at Indian Baptist Church. We just call him Uncle George, Uncle Emmanuel, and he passed recently, a couple years ago, and he was one of my uncles who I loved too. He would go hunting, and he loved to hunt. And I remember my mom would always cook for him. Like he would bring home deer, and my mom would cook in the slow cooker with some, potatoes, onions, and peppers, and loved it. So one time, Uncle George went hunting, and he got a bear. And he said to my mom, Lucille, hey, Lucille, gonna cook this bear for me? And my mom was like, I'm not cooking Yogi Bear and Boo Boo Bear. So she was like, I'll cook the deer, but I'm not cooking any bear. But he was an avid hunter and fisherman. And Priscilla Gail Bond was adopted by my grandparents, Priscilla Gail Bond. And if you see, she got the name Priscilla from my grandmother. So we see that not only did they have 10 biological children, but they actually adopted another one. And so, go ahead.
I just didn't want you to leave that page where you talked about how your family served in the military.
Right.
And not only did African Americans, I've learned recently how many of them fought in the American Revolution.
Yes, they sure did. Yeah. And you think about Crispus Attucks. Yeah, Crispus Attucks was one of the first to die in the massacre, and he was African American. Yes, sir. And he can go.
I know you talk about Bond, but Joseph Cherry, my uncle, my great uncle on Cornwallis Cherry side was a Civil War Army corporal in the Army of the Civil War. He represented all of Berkeley County. He rode around the country and everything. Joseph Cherry was a distinctive man.
I'm thankful for sharing that. And that's why I like things like that, because we get to know more about each other, because we're all related, and we get to hear those stories, which is awesome. So I'm really enjoying this as well. Like, I'm a teacher, but I like being taught as well. Yes, ma'am.
Archives hold the military records of 8,390 men born in Chowan County who fought in the Civil War as part of the United States Colored Troops. And in 1860 federal census, the total white population of Chowan County was only a bit over 6,000.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. And I just need to be mentioned, because like I said before, because I have family members who were part of the civil rights movement. And the one thing they'll say is, well, African Americans are not loyal to his country. We've been in every war. And if you ever heard of the Fort Pillow massacre, during the Civil War, and it's a tragic story where the African American troops were crucified on tent racks. Guess what they made that area? It's a theme park in Tennessee, Fort Pillow. Look it up. So they try to cover it up like, wait, no, there was a serious murder here. But now it's a park. And so with that being said, African Americans fought just as brave as anyone, Revolutionary War, all the way to the present day. Thank you, sir. Yes.
I'll also say that I am an ex-Marine.
Okay.
In 85, and I go back to the history. And like I said, I learned a lot when I was in South Carolina, PI, Paris Island. I learned a great deal. like I said, I am a revolution Marine, Simple 5.
That's a blessing. That's a blessing. My oldest brother, those are my oldest brother, T.C. Bond Jr. He was a Marine. He served for 23 years. Got injured too. He's been going through recently, but yeah, also served our country for 23 years. Served and was on 3 different continents serving our country. Yes.
2 weeks from today, on Saturday, August the 10th, if I remember about the date.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a talk at Somerset Place,
Mm-hmm.
about African American who fought in the Revolutionary War.
Thanks for letting me give me the information, because I know that will be 2 weeks from now, because I know I'm speaking somewhere August 3rd, but let me know, because I would try to make it on the 10th. Thank you for sharing that. And so I look back at my grandfather's legacy, not just him, but we see how the greatness passed on to his children and with his grandchildren here. And you know, it's interesting. You know, I have a little testimony about how I came about the book. 2 reasons why it was in me to write the book. In 2020, several of my family members passed. And Mr. Cherry knows a lot of it because he buried my dad and twin sister, my brother, and a whole bunch of people in about a 2 year span. We lost about 8 family members. It was a tough year. And so I saw a lot of family members who were not here anymore. But also, I was on Twitter. And a lot of my former students follow me on Twitter. I've taught for 26 years. And so 26 years ago, I was telling my students about my grandpa. And so I'm on Twitter one day, and they had a post about unsung inventors. One of my former students, who now about 30 years old, he says, and he tagged me, and he said, I want Dr. Bond to talk about his grandfather who invented the signal light. I'm like, you remember that from 26 years ago? Sometimes we think kids do not listen to us. You know, the stereotype is these kids are bad and annoying, disobedient. Kids listen more than you think. But he put down a post, said, I want Dr. Bond to talk about his grandfather. And I texted him, I said, you remember all that? He said, yeah, I remember talking about grandpa. And and you did a report on it too. I said, wow, you remember all that? So with that being said, that was the other motivation I had on writing about him, because not only for my family legacy's sake, but for the Bonds, the Rascal, the Spellers, the Cherries, the Smallwoods. If I missed a name, I'm sorry, because I know there's a lot of us, but we're all pretty much related. Basemores. You get the point. So I did it for us because we need it. Because here, one of the most important inventions on the automobile was constructed, and outside of Bertie County, most people don't know about it. It's not about money, but just giving him the credit and respect that he deserves, because obviously this man was a genius, and I have a doctorate degree, but I can tell you he was smarter than I ever will be. I can tell you that just from talking with him for 5 minutes. And those who knew my grandfather know that is definitely the truth. He was the most intelligent man I ever met. And talk about sense of humor, he was really funny. I remember one time he believed in the Second Amendment, and we was just chilling on his bed, and he was like, no one's gonna mess with me because I got a friend underneath my bed. And my pop is saying, a friend? What friend got underneath the bed? And my grandfather, mind you, at the time, he was about 89 years old. Handshake a little bit. He looking like, if anyone's gonna mess with me, they're gonna get some of this. We're like, Grandpa, is that loaded? He's like, I don't know, but I don't care. I'm like, Lord Jesus. But that's the type of man he was. Even with things, he had a sense of humor about it. So is there any questions you may give him now? And thank you for taking the time to listen to my grandpa's legacy.